So let's carry on chapter 2 of Eagleson's ideology. Chapter 2 being ideological strategies. I'm on my second video, video 2B, and I think I'll be able to wrap up this chapter in this video, but we'll see. So I ended the last video discussing, the set of characteristics, the set of ideological strategies, the ways that ideologies kind of function, how they work. And I looked at I listed unifying, action-oriented, rationalizing, legitimating, and universalizing, naturalizing. And I talked about unifying in the last video. Remember, they don't completely unify. So remember, think of ideologies as unifying, kind of on a spectrum of unification, right? As there are very loose unities, as I mentioned, and there are much stronger, tighter unities. And it's not really a great or a deep criticism to say, hey, that ideology doesn't really unify all its adherents into one mass. No, they tend not to. There tends to be dissent and all that for a variety of reasons. So check out the previous video for a little bit more on the unifying. And of course, in Eagleton's book, there's even more discussion. Always worth checking out. All right, so let's look at the remaining three and then a couple of Eagleton's conclusions or reflections. Action-oriented. So we normally think of kind of like in a geometric model or whatever, that you have kind of axioms and then they're applied or whatever, sort of these abstract principles, concrete situations, right? So we tend to make a very strict division between, as sort of form and content, right? As the old philosopher in me would say. And lots of people have debated that, right? That's kind of a false distinction. And for Eagleton, he's saying, a lot of these, one of the characteristics being this strategy being that it's action-oriented, it's this distinction between the ideas and the application is not really, airtight or really rigorous, right? There is kind of a feedback notion, and he spends a fair amount of time talking about the action-oriented nature. There's no rigorous split between this as abstract rules or thoughts or whatever, purely so sort of a pure theory, and then completely governing action. It doesn't quite work that way. Thought and action, this is all socially determined, right? And Eagleton is very big on, like thought and all that stuff is socially determined. That seems to be his position at the end of the day. No matter what, thought is socially determined. So we should always be looking at thought as embodied in people, right? There's no sort of free-floating zone of thought or whatever. Everything ultimately is a kind of social byproduct. But we should be careful as to where we take this idea, shall we say, ironically, where we take the idea of thought being socially conditioned or constructed or influenced or whatever. So there's no thought that is free of this. It's not the case that we can sort of come up with these completely abstract theories and they're not socially conditioned at all. That's always going to be a part of our story. But he makes an important point amongst a number of interesting points. I'm just pulling out this one that I think is quite important, because a lot of people run from the notion, or they walk rapidly, from the notion of thought being socially conditioned to, then it's all socially conditioned. Therefore, the inference, it's all the same, or it's on the same level. And he's saying, look, just because, and I put a little cross here, just because you believe this, right? Do not infer, the arrow meaning infer, do not infer that all thought is of equal value, right? So because some people would say, science is kind of a social byproduct, and you can make the argument that there's something there. Lots of art is, but let's stick to science for a second. Even if science is got a social product, does that mean that all social products are on the same level with science? That science is just no different than any other social product? I think that's a tougher argument to push, right? Because that would apply to all kinds of things like medicine and physics and all that stuff. It's just any way of talking about the universe and the solar system in a non-scientific way, just another cultural byproduct, as general relativity is a cultural byproduct. I think that's a harder argument to make. People try and make it. I think what Eagleton is saying, we should resist at least just making the inference and assuming it, just like leaping from social conditioned thought to all thought is of equal value. you got to make an argument. So if you want to tell me that there are other ways of viewing the universe, that constructing it and how it runs and all that stuff, that are on the same level as general relativity and quantum mechanics, I'm like, hey, go for it. I've read enough Quine where it's like, if you have another game, I think science right now is the best game. But if you have another game, I'm more than willing to sit down and listen to it. But I'm not willing to just have someone go, oh, it's all socially conditioned, therefore it's all of the same value. That is something I would tend to be very sympathetic to Eagleton. It's like, no, it's not. That doesn't follow. And I think the same thing here. He says, look, he doesn't quite go into this, but I think it's a common thing that people say, well, look, oh, hey, look, if all thought is socially conditioned and moral systems are systems of thought and rules and norms and all that stuff, well, then moral systems are all culturally conditioned. Probably, unless you believe in some divine intuition. But if you don't, and you're kind of going from the materialist sense, and you say, yeah, it's all socially conditioned, therefore all moral systems are of equal value, that doesn't follow. That you need an argument for. You don't just get to run to that or walk quickly to that. I would be much of the view that even if I said yes to this and yes to all this, I don't think you can make those quick inferences legitimately. You can make them, but they're not legitimate. You have to have a good story as to why all these systems, moral systems, would be of equal value. So that's a tricky one. So it doesn't automatically follow that just because you agree on the social conditions of thought to anything goes and it's all the same. Okay, so I think that's an important thing that he points out. Okay, so, but nonetheless, this is what tends to be characteristic of these kinds of systems, that there's a feedback loop and they tend to give you some sort of impetus to doing things. So it'd be very odd if someone, claimed to have a system of beliefs that was in any way ideological, but it didn't tell them to do anything, right? So that's a little weird. It tends to be that ideologies link up in some way or integrated with behavior. All right. Ideology is not just, okay, so this kind of, again, these are not watertight categories, so don't just think that you can have, these should almost be like little dotted lines. But rationalizing and legitimating, I mean, that's very close to this, right? As I mentioned in the previous video. Ideologies, they don't just express interests or social interests or claims and beliefs. They're not just simply neutral like that, right? Again, they're linked up with action. And they are not only linked up kind of with action, but they're linked up with this intrinsic kind of rationalizing of action, right? It's not only a thing you do, but it's kind of like a norm. You should do it, right? You ought to do it. It would be a good thing if you did it. That's built into the ideology as well. So they rationalize certain social interests, right? Whatever those happen to be, how you want to organize society or whatever, you can find an ideology that will have some kind of abstract principles that link with behavior, that link with norms, that tell you that this is what you should do in order to get those social interests. So it's not just an expression, it's a vehicle to instantiate those expressions. And of course, it can do this in a variety of ways. Now, in one way, it can do it sort of at the more abstract level with logic and language, making it harder, putting forward arguments. Also, think about George Orwell's 1984, where they remove words, right? The removing words from the language that don't fit with the Big Brother view of the world. So it gets harder and harder to think outside of the box, so to speak. So it closes off criticism. And through logic and language. Now, and then this sort of bleeds into an even stronger way of rationalizing, legitimating. So Eagleton kind of links these up. As I said, you think of these as sort of broken. It's not real, full bulkheads, watertight bulkheads, but more somewhat subtler distinctions. The universalizing and naturalizing aspect, right, is to make it, well, everyone does this. This is, you're thinking kind of out of the box, and nobody thinks like that, right? What are you doing thinking like that? This is the way, and sort of creating this kind of bandwagon effect. And of course, we all know from logic that's a fallacy, but it can be a very powerful motivator. Peer pressure is extremely powerful. People do not like standing outside of their peers, right? Go into a group conversation, and if there's 10 of you and you're the 10th person to speak and 9 people pushed in a certain direction, not many of us want to be that 10th person that says, wait a minute, I disagree with all of this, right? So this is ideologies have a sort of, they do have a unifying, and they do have a legitimating, and they do have a sort of kind of galvanizing effect, right? Sort of to make it like, well, this is what everyone's doing. It stands to reason that this is what we do. And then of course the stronger one is to make it, well, if you're not doing what everyone else is doing, you're not simply out of the group, like not doing what we're doing, you're kind of unnatural. This is an unnatural way you're behaving, right? Our group is not just simply a group. We are sort of coextensive with, let's say, you get into the darker spots of ideologies where this is what naturally humans are like, right? This is the natural thing. So people that are not aligned with us are not really being kind of people anymore. They're outside of the framework. So it tends to naturalize itself and identify itself with the natural order of things. So you're breaking some kind of, I don't know, kind of God's will or God's order or the natural way of being by going outside this ideology. So it presents itself not only maybe in a logical sense of self-evident, but if you're working properly, if you're moral and all that, you'll just see it this way. And sometimes people will say, I just can't understand anyone who doesn't see the world the way I do. Like why? Because I'm not immoral. I'm a moral person. That's why I see the world the way I do. So I would have to be an immoral person to disagree. So understanding is tied up with morality. It's tied up with all kinds of things. So it's a rather pernicious force. This notion of naturalizing, making things impossible, and I would say not only impossible, but making alternatives immoral to believe, right? Like, oh, you don't agree with me, therefore you are some kind of bad person, right? And not just maybe you have mental cognitive issues. No, you have you're broken moral. So it's self-evident not only in a cognitive sense, but a moral, ethical sense. This is just right. Okay, so as you can see, that's pretty heavy-duty stuff, that the strategies, these ideological strategies, right, what they tend to do. So you want to be definitely thinking about that and be on the lookout for that. All right, so anyways, there's a lot more stuff going on there. Let's just look a little bit at Eagleton's concluding thoughts here. These strategies, he says, don't kid yourself. They're not just used by dominant ideologies, because a lot of times we tend to think, oh yeah, that's like the power, right? The powers that be, they do this kind of stuff. And he's saying, no, this is often other, oppositional ideologies, people who have other groups or whatever. They will do a lot of these same kinds of things. These are recruitment devices. These are retention devices as well. People get in these things. They can't see things otherwise, right? So, in that sense, they engage in these mechanisms, and he says, that this is what activists, to a large extent are doing, right? They basically, John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, said a lot of people that are engaged in activism, they just want to kick out the old orthodoxy and bring in their orthodoxy, right? That they want to replace one way of speaking and acting with their way of speaking and acting. You've got to be careful of that. And I think there's lots to be said about that. So, he notes that many activists are trying to normalize or naturalize their views of the world. Oh, well, something's wrong out there. It's deeply immoral. And I'm going to give you not just an alternative that's moral, but I'm going to give you an even stronger notion that sort of a natural alternative. And of course, that natural alternative is universal. It's legitimate. It's rational in that sense. So, and he says, maybe even many activists, they might be leery, he says, they might be leery of this sort of global national thing that they've maybe come to reject as sort of an old traditional and outmoded way of reasoning about abstract things and all that. He said they're probably, as he said, maybe in the end, they're just running this kind of line, some sort of moral relativist or liberal pluralist line. So either they're kind of doing the things that they're rejecting that for other people to do and imposing their new way, or maybe they're lapsing into something like this. And both of these things should definitely be regarded as an ideological strategy. And I think the takeaway is for those of us who are studying this to be at least keep this in mind. All right, that's I managed to finish it in 2 lectures. Okay, so that's chapter 2. See you next video.